Welcome back, Midnight Stories family. Get ready for another heart-touching tale. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Now let's dive into today's story. The flickering light of a faulty street lamp illuminated the quiet cul-de-sac, casting eerie shadows against the tightly shut windows. A man in a dark overcoat, his face hidden beneath a hood, stood still, gripping a manila envelope in one hand. The soft hum of a distant car engine broke the silence, and he turned sharply, his eyes scanning the empty street. Inside the house, behind drawn curtains, a woman paced nervously, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. The faint glow of her screen revealed a string of unanswered messages. Her breathing was shallow, her heart pounding in anticipation of what was coming. She paused, glancing at the framed photo on the mantelpiece, a picture of her and her husband on their wedding day, smiling brightly. The memory felt like a cruel joke now. The man outside took a deep breath, his hand trembling slightly as he slid the envelope into the mailbox. The metal latch clanged loudly in the stillness of the night. He hesitated for a moment as if reconsidering, then turned and walked briskly to his car. The engine roared to life, and the taillights vanished into the darkness. Moments later, the woman's phone buzzed. She jumped, her eyes widening as she read the notification. Her lips quivered and she whispered to herself, "No, this can't be happening." Just as she reached for the door, the sound of tires screeching to a halt echoed through the street. Red and blue lights lit up the night, flashing through the curtains. The woman froze, her hand hovering over the doorknob. A loud knock followed, authoritative and unrelenting. "Police." "Open the door," a voice commanded. Her body trembled as she stepped back, her breath catching in her throat. The world seemed to close in around her, every sound amplified. The sirens, the pounding of her heart, and the faint sound of footsteps closing in. As the door creaked open, the truth she had fought so hard to hide was about to come crashing down. This was no ordinary visit, it was the beginning of a reckoning. Transition. As shadows stretched across the room, a secret was about to unfold, one that would change everything. Eric Sanders wasn't just a private investigator, he was meticulous, almost obsessive about details. It was this trait that had made him one of the best in his field, and it was the same trait that now haunted him. Every detail of Jessica's betrayal played in his mind like a broken record. He couldn't escape the image of her with Ryan, the way her laughter seemed freer, the way she dressed up for him in ways she hadn't for Eric in years, the way she had chosen someone else over the life they had built together. Eric hadn't always been this way. In the early years of their marriage he was carefree, confident, and full of ambition. Jessica had brought a spark to his life, her vibrant personality balancing his steady demeanor. Together they had built a home, one filled with laughter, warmth, and the kind of love people envied. But somewhere along the way life had dulled that spark. The demands of his job, the pressures of raising kids, and the monotony of routine had taken their toll. He didn't notice it at first, how Jessica's smiles became less frequent, how her gaze lingered on the horizon as if she were searching for something more. Jessica's dissatisfaction wasn't new, it had been brewing for years. She had grown up in a small town, dreaming of a life filled with adventure and romance. Meeting Eric had felt like the beginning of that dream. He was attentive, stable, and everything she thought she needed. But as the years passed, she couldn't help but feel trapped. The white picket fence, the PTA meetings, the predictable dinners, it wasn't enough. She wanted excitement, something to break the monotony. When Ryan entered her life, he seemed like the answer to all her unspoken prayers. Ryan Carter was a man who knew how to take what he wanted. With his expensive suits, flashy car, and air of confidence, he was the embodiment of the life Jessica thought she deserved. Their relationship began innocently enough. A few flirtatious comments during her shifts at the restaurant, a lingering glance here and there. But Ryan wasn't one to settle for subtlety. He pursued her relentlessly, showering her with gifts and attention that made her feel alive again. Jessica knew it was wrong, but the thrill was intoxicating. It wasn't long before their flirtation turned into something much deeper, and much darker. While Jessica indulged in her affair, Eric began to change. He became quieter, more withdrawn, but also more vigilant. He noticed every detail, how Jessica started wearing perfume she hadn't touched in years, how she spent hours on her phone, how she seemed almost relieved when he had to work late. Eric's job had trained him to read people, to see beyond their words and into their actions. And Jessica's actions were screaming at him. At first, Eric tried to rationalize it. Maybe she was just stressed, or maybe she needed some space. But the evidence piled up. A credit card statement showing charges at a luxury hotel he had never been to. A strand of blonde hair on her coat, too long to be her own. And then there were the late nights when she claimed to be working but couldn't provide a single detail about her shift. Eric knew something was wrong, but confronting her without proof wasn't an option. So he did what he did best. He investigated. He planted a GPS tracker on her car, reviewed her phone records, and even followed her one evening when she said she was meeting friends. What he found confirmed his worst fears. Jessica wasn't meeting friends, she was meeting Ryan. Eric watched from the shadows as they embraced outside the hotel, their laughter echoing in the cool night air. The betrayal hit him like a punch to the gut, but he kept his composure. He needed more. He needed a plan. Jessica, oblivious to Eric's discovery, continued her affair. But it wasn't as perfect as she had imagined. Ryan's charm had a dark edge. He was possessive, questioning her every move and demanding more of her time. The excitement that had drawn her to him began to feel suffocating. She started to wonder if she had made a mistake, but every time she tried to pull away, Ryan would remind her of the life he promised. A life far removed from the one she had with Eric. The tension at home was palpable. Lila, ever observant, began to ask questions. Why is Daddy so quiet lately? Why don't you and Daddy laugh anymore? Jessica would force a smile and assure her daughter that everything was fine, but the cracks were impossible to hide. Ben, in his innocence, tried to bridge the gap with his jokes and playful antics, but even he couldn't ignore the weight in the air. Eric's breaking point came on an otherwise ordinary day. Jessica had left her phone on the kitchen counter while she showered. A notification caught his eye, a message from Ryan. Without hesitation, Eric unlocked the phone and began reading. The messages were explicit, detailing plans for a weekend getaway. Each word was a dagger, confirming what he had already known. But there was more. Ryan wasn't just Jessica's lover. He was manipulative, demanding, and reckless. The messages revealed a side of Ryan that Jessica hadn't told him about. A side that made Eric's anger turn to something darker, determination. Eric spent the next few weeks gathering every piece of evidence he could. Photos, emails, receipts, he documented everything. It wasn't just about the affair anymore, it was about protecting his family. He knew Jessica's actions weren't just a betrayal of their marriage, they were a threat to their children's future. One night, after putting the kids to bed, Eric sat Jessica down at the dining table. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Jessica looked at him, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and confusion. Eric slid a folder across the table without saying a word. Jessica hesitated, her hands trembling as she opened it. The photos, the emails, the receipts, it was all there. Her betrayal laid bare. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Eric's voice was calm, but his eyes burned with anger. Jessica's lips quivered as tears streamed down her face. "Eric, she began, but the words wouldn't come. There was nothing she could say to undo what she had done. Eric stood, his expression unreadable. "You've made your choices," he said quietly. "Now it's time to face the consequences." Behind closed doors, their lives were anything but ordinary. Transition, the choices they had made were catching up to them, and there was no escaping the consequences. Eric's discovery of Jessica's affair wasn't just the end of trust. It was the beginning of a storm he could feel brewing. While Jessica cried quietly that night, her guilt spilling out in incoherent apologies, Eric remained calm. His mind was already working on what came next. It wasn't enough for her to say she was sorry, and it wasn't enough for him to simply leave. Jessica's betrayal had stripped him of everything: his pride, his peace, his family. He needed to ensure that she felt the weight of what she had done. The following days were tense. Jessica tried to pretend things were normal for the sake of the kids, but Eric wasn't playing along. He stayed distant, cold, but he didn't leave the house. Every time Jessica looked at him, her stomach churned with dread. She knew Eric wasn't the type to let this go, and his silence was more terrifying than if he'd yelled or thrown things. It was like living with a stranger who held all the power. Jessica's life with Ryan, once thrilling and intoxicating, now felt like a noose tightening around her neck. Ryan wasn't happy when she started pulling away, claiming she needed to fix things at home. His texts became more aggressive, his tone more demanding. He accused her of using him, of leading him on. Jessica tried to explain, but Ryan wasn't interested in explanations. He wanted her, and he wasn't going to let her go without a fight. Eric, meanwhile, was gathering his ammunition. The evidence he had collected wasn't just for his own satisfaction. It was for the authorities. During his surveillance, he had discovered something far more damning than an affair. Ryan Carter wasn't just a businessman. He was a man with a history of shady dealings. Eric dug deeper, using every resource at his disposal. He uncovered financial fraud, bribery, and connections to illegal activities. Ryan wasn't just a threat to Eric's marriage. He was a threat to anyone who crossed his path. Jessica's affair had placed her directly in Ryan's orbit, making her a liability. And now, with Eric's investigation closing in, the stakes were higher than ever. Eric knew he couldn't just confront Ryan. He needed to bring him down in a way that would protect his family and ensure justice was served. But doing so meant risking everything. The tension reached a boiling point when Ryan showed up unannounced at Jessica's workplace. He was charming and polite in front of her co-workers, but the moment they were alone, his true colors came out. "You think you can just walk away from me?" he hissed, his grip tightening on her arm. Jessica tried to pull away, but Ryan's strength and fury were overwhelming. "If you think you can run back to your husband and pretend this never happened, you're wrong. You belong to me now." Jessica was terrified, but she couldn't let it show. "Ryan, please, I just need time. Eric knows everything and I have to." Ryan's laughter cut her off. "Eric? What's he going to do? He's a nobody. You think he scares me? Let him try." That night, Jessica finally told Eric the truth. She confessed everything, not just the affair, but the threats Ryan had made and the fear that he wouldn't let her go. Eric listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. When she finished, he stood and walked to his office, closing the door behind him. Jessica sat in the silence, her hands trembling as she wondered what he was planning. Eric didn't sleep that night. Instead, he mapped out his next steps. He contacted a trusted friend in law enforcement, sharing the evidence he had collected. The friend, Detective Mark Hayes, had worked with Eric on several cases and knew his reputation for thoroughness. "This is serious, Eric," Mark said after reviewing the files. "If half of this checks out, we're dealing with a dangerous man. But going after him won't be easy." "I don't care how hard it is," Eric replied. "He's threatened my family, and I'm not going to sit back and let him get away with it." As Mark began building a case against Ryan, Eric turned his attention back to Jessica. He wasn't ready to forgive her. He wasn't even sure if he wanted to, but he knew they needed to present a united front. "If we're going to get through this, you need to trust me," he told her. "No more secrets. No more lies." Jessica nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'll do whatever it takes to fix this, Eric. I just want our family to be safe." But safety was a luxury they didn't have. Ryan wasn't the type to back down, and Eric knew it was only a matter of time before he made his next move. Sure enough, a few days later, Eric received an anonymous envelope in the mail. Inside was a single photograph, Jessica and the kids at the park, taken from a distance. The message was clear: Ryan was watching. What seemed thrilling in the moment was quickly spiraling out of control. Jessica panicked when she saw the photo, but Eric remained calm. "This is exactly what he wants," he said. "He's trying to scare us into making a mistake. But we're not going to give him that satisfaction." Eric doubled down on his efforts to bring Ryan to justice. He worked closely with Mark, providing more evidence and helping coordinate a sting operation. At the same time, he kept a close eye on his family, ensuring their safety at all times. Jessica, too, began to change. She stopped taking Ryan's calls, blocked his number, and focused on rebuilding her relationship with Eric and the kids. It wasn't easy, trust was hard to rebuild, and the threat of Ryan loomed over them like a dark cloud. The final straw came when Ryan made an unexpected appearance at their home. It was late at night, and the family was asleep when the doorbell rang. Eric opened the door to find Ryan standing there, his face twisted with anger. "We need to talk," Ryan said, his voice low and threatening. Eric didn't flinch. "There's nothing to talk about. You need to leave." Ryan stepped closer, his fists clenched. "You think you can take me down? You think your little files and your cop buddy are going to scare me? You have no idea who you're dealing with." Eric stood his ground, his voice steady. "Neither do you." Unbeknownst to Ryan, Mark and his team were already en route, having been tipped off by Eric. Moments later, the sound of sirens filled the air, and red and blue lights flashed through the windows. Ryan's bravado faltered as officers surrounded him, their guns drawn. He was arrested on the spot, his reign of terror finally coming to an end. Jessica watched from the window, her emotions a whirlwind of relief, guilt, and gratitude. Eric turned to her, his expression softening for the first time in weeks. "It's over," he said quietly. "We're safe now." But as they embraced, Eric couldn't shake the feeling that the damage had already been done. Their lives would never be the same, and the road to healing was just beginning. The days following Ryan's arrest brought a brief sense of relief, but it didn't last. The case against him wasn't airtight, and Eric knew that a man like Ryan would have resources, connections, and a relentless desire for revenge. Eric and Jessica quickly realized that their nightmare was far from over. Despite Ryan being in custody, his influence lingered like a shadow. His lawyers were aggressive, filing motions to delay the trial and demanding that the evidence Eric had provided be thrown out due to alleged illegality in how it was obtained. The legal battles alone were enough to keep Eric and Jessica on edge, but the psychological toll was even worse. Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Whenever she walked the kids to school or went to the grocery store, she felt eyes on her. One afternoon, she noticed a black car parked down the street from their house. She tried to convince herself it was nothing, but when it appeared again the next day, she couldn't ignore it. Eric reassured her that they were safe, but even he began to double-check the locks at night and glance over his shoulder more often. Eric wasn't just dealing with the external threats. He was battling his own internal conflict. His anger toward Jessica hadn't disappeared, even though they were working together to protect their family. Every time he looked at her, he saw the betrayal, the lies, and the pain she had caused. Jessica, for her part, was trying desperately to make amends. She cooked his favorite meals, left him handwritten notes apologizing for everything, and tried to rekindle the connection they once had. But Eric's walls were high and she couldn't break through. The tension between them came to a head one evening when Eric found Jessica sitting at the kitchen table, staring at her phone. She had received a text from an unknown number. "You think this is over? It's just the beginning." Jessica's hands shook as she handed the phone to Eric. "I don't know who it is," she said, her voice trembling. "It could be Ryan or someone working for him." Eric's jaw tightened as he read the message. "We're not going to let him scare us," he said firmly, though his own anxiety was bubbling beneath the surface. He called Mark immediately, who promised to look into it. But the message had already done its damage. It had planted seeds of fear that would be hard to uproot. The kids too were beginning to notice that something was wrong. Lila, always perceptive, asked Jessica one night, "Mom, why is Dad always so serious now? Did I do something wrong?" Jessica's heart broke as she hugged her daughter, assuring her that everything was fine. But Lila wasn't convinced, and neither was Ben, who had started having nightmares about bad guys coming to take them away. Meanwhile, Eric's investigation into Ryan's network uncovered more troubling information. Ryan had associates who were just as dangerous as he was, people who wouldn't hesitate to retaliate if they felt threatened. One name stood out: Marcus Kane, a former enforcer who had worked with Ryan on several shady deals. Marcus was known for his ruthless tactics, and Eric suspected he was the one behind the threatening messages Jessica had received. Eric's fears were confirmed when Mark called him with an update. "We've been monitoring Ryan's associates and Marcus Kane is definitely involved," Mark said. "He's been seen near your neighborhood a few times. We're doing everything we can to keep him under surveillance, but I need you to be careful." Eric's heart sank. He had expected Ryan to retaliate, but he hadn't anticipated just how far his reach extended. He installed security cameras around the house, changed their daily routines, and even considered moving to a new city. But Jessica was hesitant. "This is our home," she said. "I don't want to uproot the kids unless we absolutely have to." Despite their precautions, the tension only grew. One night, the family was jolted awake by the sound of shattering glass. Eric grabbed a baseball bat and rushed downstairs, finding a brick lying in the middle of their living room. Attached to it was a note: "You can't hide forever." The police were called, but there wasn't much they could do. The incident left the family shaken, and Eric realized that their fight wasn't just against Ryan, it was against an entire system of people who thrived on intimidation and violence. Jessica broke down that night, sobbing into Eric's chest. "I'm so sorry," she cried. "This is all my fault." Eric held her, his own emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "We'll get through this," he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. The following days were a blur of anxiety and uncertainty. Eric spent hours working with Mark and his team, trying to piece together enough evidence to take down Ryan's entire operation. Jessica focused on keeping the kids' lives as normal as possible, though every day felt like walking on a tightrope. The kids, sensing the tension, began acting out in small ways. Ben refusing to go to bed, Lila snapping at her brother over trivial things. The cracks in their family were becoming harder to ignore. Then came the breaking point. Eric returned home one evening to find Jessica sitting on the floor of the living room, tears streaming down her face. She was holding another envelope, this one containing photos of Lila and Ben at school. "He's watching them," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What if he hurts them?" Eric's anger boiled over. "That's it," he said, his voice firm. "We're not waiting for him to make the next move. We're going to end this once and for all." With Mark's help, Eric devised a plan to lure Marcus Kane into a trap. It was risky, but it was their best chance to send a message to Ryan and his associates that they wouldn't back down. Jessica was hesitant, fearing for Eric's safety, but he assured her that it was the only way to protect their family. The night of the operation was tense. Eric and Mark waited in an abandoned warehouse where Marcus was supposed to meet an undercover officer posing as a buyer for one of Ryan's illicit deals. Jessica stayed home with the kids, pacing nervously as she waited for news. Every second felt like an eternity. When Marcus arrived, he was met with a SWAT team instead of a buyer. The operation went off without a hitch, and Marcus was arrested on the spot. But as Eric watched him being taken away, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Ryan still had allies, and as long as he was out there, the danger remained. With every move, the walls seemed to close in tighter. Eric's relief from Marcus Kane's arrest was short-lived. 2 days later, a package arrived on their doorstep, unmarked and eerily unassuming. Inside was a USB drive and a simple note: "Watch this before you make any more mistakes." Eric and Jessica stared at the drive as though it were a ticking bomb. "What if it's a trap?" Jessica whispered, her voice trembling. Eric plugged the drive into his laptop, his jaw clenched. The screen flickered to life, revealing grainy footage of a dimly lit room. Seated at a table was Ryan Carter, his demeanor cool and unbothered despite being behind bars. He leaned forward, speaking directly into the camera. "You think you've won, Eric?" Ryan's voice was calm, but his words dripped with venom. "You've made things difficult, sure. But do you really think this ends with Marcus? I have people everywhere. People who owe me. People who fear me. Your family isn't as safe as you think." Ryan leaned back, a sinister smile spreading across his face. "And Jessica, I warned you what would happen if you crossed me. Do you think he'll forgive you when he learns the rest? When he sees just how deep your betrayal runs?" The video ended abruptly, leaving Eric and Jessica in stunned silence. Jessica's face was pale, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Eric turned to her, his voice low and dangerous. "What does he mean, Jessica? What haven't you told me?" Tears welled in Jessica's eyes as she shook her head. "I don't know. He's just trying to get into your head, Eric. Don't let him. Don't lie to me." Eric's voice cracked, his frustration boiling over. "I've given you a chance to come clean, Jessica. If there's something else, anything, tell me now." Jessica broke down, her sobs racking her body. "It wasn't just the affair," she admitted, her voice barely audible. I helped him." Eric's heart sank. "Helped him? Helped him how?" Jessica wiped her tears, struggling to meet his gaze. "It started small. He'd ask me to deliver envelopes, pick up packages. I didn't think much of it at first. But then he asked me to move money for him. He said it was for business, but I knew it wasn't. I was just so caught up in everything, Eric. I didn't stop to think about what I was doing." Eric's fists clenched as he processed her words. "You laundered money for him? Do you have any idea what you've done? What you've involved our family in?" Jessica nodded, her tears falling freely. "I'm so sorry, Eric. I thought I could handle it. I thought I could keep it separate. But it got out of control." Eric stood abruptly, pacing the room as anger and disbelief consumed him. "Do you understand what this means, Jessica? You're not just an accomplice. You're a liability. Ryan will use this against us. Against you." Jessica's voice broke as she whispered, "I didn't know who else to turn to. I thought if I kept him happy, he'd leave us alone." The fallout was immediate. Eric called Mark, his tone urgent as he relayed the revelation. Mark was furious but not surprised. "This changes everything," he said. "If Jessica was involved, even indirectly, we need to figure out how deep this goes. And we need to figure it out fast." Jessica, overwhelmed with guilt, offered to go to the police and confess everything. But Eric stopped her. "Not yet. If we do this wrong, Ryan's people will know we're onto them. We need to be strategic." In the days that followed, Eric and Mark worked tirelessly to piece together the puzzle. Jessica provided information about the transactions she had been involved in, detailing names, locations, and amounts. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became that Ryan's network was more extensive than they had imagined. The revelation strained Eric and Jessica's already fragile relationship. Every conversation felt like a minefield, every glance a reminder of the betrayal. Lila and Ben, sensing the tension, grew more withdrawn. The once lively home was now steeped in silence and unease. Then came the breaking point. One evening, as the family tried to enjoy a semblance of normalcy with a quiet dinner, the doorbell rang. Eric and Jessica exchanged nervous glances before Eric approached the door cautiously. A man stood on the porch, his face unfamiliar but his intentions clear. "You Eric Sanders?" the man asked, his voice gruff. Eric nodded, his guard up. "Who's asking?" The man smirked. "Just delivering a message." He tossed a small package onto the porch and walked away, disappearing into the night. Inside the package was another note, this one far more direct. "Jessica's mistakes are your mistakes now. If you don't back off, the next package won't be so friendly." Eric slammed his fist on the table, his rage finally erupting. "This has to end, Jessica. You've put all of us in danger, and I won't stand for it anymore." Jessica broke down again, pleading for forgiveness. "I never wanted this, Eric. I never wanted any of this." The family's world continued to unravel. Jessica's involvement in Ryan's operations became public knowledge after a leak to the media, likely orchestrated by Ryan's associates. Eric's reputation as a private investigator took a hit, with clients questioning his judgment and integrity. Friends and neighbors began to distance themselves, whispering about the scandal that had engulfed the Sanders family. The final blow came when Mark informed Eric that Ryan had struck a deal. Despite the mountain of evidence against him, Ryan had agreed to cooperate with authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence. Part of that cooperation included naming names, including Jessica's. In one moment, everything they thought they knew was shattered. Eric and Jessica faced a decision: fight the charges and risk everything, or cooperate and hope for leniency. Jessica, knowing the damage she had caused, chose the latter. She provided a full confession, detailing her role in Ryan's operations and the extent of his network. Her cooperation helped bring down several of Ryan's associates, but it came at a cost. Jessica was sentenced to 2 years in prison, a decision that left Lila and Ben devastated. Eric, despite everything, vowed to keep the family together. He became both mother and father, working tirelessly to provide for his kids while visiting Jessica regularly. The fallout was brutal, but it was also a turning point. Jessica's time in prison forced her to confront her actions and the pain she had caused. Eric, too, began to heal, though the scars of betrayal would never fully fade. In the end, they learned that trust, once broken, could only be rebuilt one day at a time. And while their story was far from a happy ending, it was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is always a chance for redemption. The weeks after Jessica's sentencing were some of the darkest in Eric's life. The house felt empty without her, but the silence wasn't peaceful. It was a constant reminder of everything that had fallen apart. Lila and Ben struggled to make sense of their mother's absence. Lila, in her preteen wisdom, refused to cry but became distant and cold, retreating to her room for hours. Ben, on the other hand, couldn't stop asking questions. "When is Mom coming back?" he would ask every night before bed, his innocent eyes searching Eric's face for reassurance. Eric had no easy answers. "Mom made a mistake," he would say gently, "but she's working to make things right. She loves you very much." But no matter how many times he repeated those words, they felt hollow. He could see the pain in his children's eyes, and it only deepened his guilt. Eric blamed himself for not seeing the signs earlier, for letting his own life grow so distant from Jessica's that he hadn't realized how far she had fallen. The legal repercussions of Jessica's involvement with Ryan were only the beginning. The media picked up the story, and their family became the center of unwanted attention. Headlines like PI's wife caught in money laundering scandal and behind the suburban facade. A family's dark secrets plastered local papers and online forums. Eric, once respected in his field, found himself losing clients. Longtime neighbors who had once waved warmly now avoided eye contact, their whispered judgments louder than words. The financial strain was another blow. With Jessica in prison, Eric had to juggle his work as a private investigator with being a full-time parent. The savings they had carefully built over the years were rapidly depleting, eaten away by legal fees, therapy for the kids, and the mounting cost of keeping their home. Eric took on smaller, less lucrative cases, often working late into the night just to stay afloat. One evening, as he sat in his office sifting through old files, his phone buzzed. It was Mark. "Eric," Mark began, his voice tense, "we've hit a snag." Eric leaned forward, his heart sinking. "What now?" "Ryan's deal isn't holding up like we thought. He's not cooperating as fully as he promised, and his associates are still active. We've got intel that one of them, Marcus Kane, has been asking about you." Eric's grip on the phone tightened. "What does he want?" "Revenge, most likely. He blames you for Ryan's arrest and the fallout. We're keeping an eye on him, but I thought you should know." Eric hung up, his stomach churning. Marcus Kane was dangerous, and the idea of him targeting Eric or his family was unbearable. He installed additional locks on the doors, added more security cameras, and even taught Lila and Ben basic safety protocols. But the anxiety never left. Every knock at the door, every unfamiliar car on the street, sent his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Jessica's time in prison was no less harrowing. The harsh reality of her environment forced her to confront the choices that had led her there. Days were spent working in the prison kitchen, while nights were filled with sleepless guilt. She thought about her children constantly, wondering if they hated her, if they would ever forgive her. Letters from Eric arrived weekly, filled with updates about Lila and Ben, but his words were distant, formal. The love they had once shared seemed irreparably broken. Jessica found solace in a prison counselor named Maria, who encouraged her to write letters to her children. "Even if they don't understand now, they'll appreciate it later," Maria said. Jessica poured her heart into those letters, apologizing, explaining, and promising to make amends. Back at home, Eric faced a new wave of conflict when Marcus Kane made his presence known. It started with subtle intimidation tactics. A slashed tire on Eric's car, threatening notes left on his office door. Then one night, Eric came home to find the house ransacked. Drawers were pulled open, furniture overturned, and a single message was scrawled on the wall in red spray paint. "You're next." Eric called the police, but there was little they could do. Mark assured him that they were monitoring Marcus, but it was cold comfort. The message was clear. Marcus wasn't going to stop until Eric paid for his role in Ryan's downfall. The tension reached its peak when Marcus made a direct move. Late one night, as Eric worked in his office, the power suddenly went out. The house plunged into darkness, and Eric's heart raced as he reached for the baseball bat he kept by his desk. He heard the faint sound of footsteps outside, followed by a quiet knock on the back door. "Who's there?" Eric called out, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. There was no answer, only the sound of glass shattering in the living room. Eric moved cautiously, his bat gripped tightly in his hands. He found Marcus standing in the middle of the room, a knife glinting in his hand. "You've caused me a lot of trouble, Sanders," Marcus growled. "Time to settle the score." Eric didn't hesitate. He swung the bat, narrowly missing Marcus as the man lunged toward him. The struggle was intense, with both men grappling for control. Just as Marcus pinned Eric against the wall, the sound of sirens filled the air. Mark and his team had arrived, bursting into the house and subduing Marcus before he could do any more harm. The aftermath left Eric shaken but determined. Marcus was arrested, and his ties to Ryan's network were further exposed. The ordeal brought a new level of clarity to Eric's life. He realized that, despite everything, his priority was protecting his children and finding a way to rebuild their lives. The cost of their choices was now impossible to ignore. Jessica, hearing about the attack through one of Eric's letters, was consumed with guilt. She vowed to use her time in prison to make meaningful changes, attending counseling sessions and participating in programs to help her reintegrate into society. She knew it would take more than words to earn her family's forgiveness, but she was willing to do the work. For Eric, the road to redemption was equally challenging. He began seeing a therapist, working through the anger and betrayal that had consumed him. Slowly, he started to open up to the idea of forgiving Jessica, not for her sake but for his own. He didn't want to carry the weight of resentment any longer. Lila and Ben, though still processing the upheaval, began to show signs of healing. Lila started drawing again, filling her sketchbook with pictures of their family before everything fell apart. Ben, ever the optimist, often asked, "When Mom comes home, can we have a big family dinner like we used to?" Eric would smile, the hope in his son's eyes giving him strength. "Yeah, buddy," he'd say. "We'll figure it out." As the days turned into months, the Sanders family slowly pieced their lives back together. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't easy, but it was a start. And for the first time in a long time, Eric allowed himself to believe that they might just make it through. The day of Jessica's release from prison loomed on the calendar like an uncertain storm. For Eric, it felt like standing at the edge of a precipice. He had spent months rebuilding his life with Lila and Ben, working to restore a sense of normalcy. Jessica's return promised to disrupt that fragile equilibrium. Would her presence heal the family or reopen old wounds? Jessica, too, was filled with equal parts hope and dread. She had poured her heart into every therapy session, every letter, and every thought of reconciliation. Yet, the fear of rejection gnawed at her. Would Eric truly forgive her? Would her children even recognize her as their mother? These questions haunted her every night in the small, sterile cell that had become her world. When the day finally came, Jessica walked out of the prison gates with a small duffel bag in hand and a heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the officer's parting words. Eric waited in the car, leaning against the door, his arms crossed. His face was stoic, unreadable, but his presence there at all gave Jessica a sliver of hope. The drive home was silent, save for the faint hum of the engine. Jessica glanced at Eric, trying to read his thoughts, but his gaze remained fixed on the road. "Thank you for picking me up," she finally said, her voice trembling. Eric nodded but said nothing. As they pulled into the driveway, Jessica's hands tightened around the strap of her bag. The house looked the same, but it felt different, like a place she didn't belong anymore. Lila and Ben stood on the porch, their expressions a mix of curiosity and hesitation. Jessica's heart broke as she saw the uncertainty in their eyes. "Hi, babies," she said, stepping out of the car and kneeling to their level. Lila stayed close to the door, her arms crossed defensively. Ben, however, ran forward, wrapping his arms around her. "I missed you, Mom," he whispered, burying his face in her shoulder. Jessica held him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "I missed you too, sweetheart. I missed you so much." Lila, still rooted in place, finally spoke. "Why did you do it?" Her voice was sharp, cutting through the emotional reunion like a blade. Jessica's tears fell harder. "I made a mistake, Lila. A terrible mistake. And I've been trying to make up for it every day since. I know I hurt you and I'm so sorry." Lila's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. "Sorry doesn't change what happened," she muttered before retreating inside. The weight of Lila's words hung heavily in the air as Eric helped Jessica bring her things inside. The house was painfully familiar, yet it felt foreign to her. The framed family photos, the toys scattered in the living room, these were pieces of a life she had left behind, one she wasn't sure she could reclaim. That night, as the kids slept, Eric and Jessica sat in the kitchen. A single lamp cast a dim glow over the room, illuminating the tension between them. Jessica broke the silence first. "Eric, I know things will never be the same, but I want to fix this. I want to fix us." Eric looked at her, his face a mask of exhaustion and lingering anger. "You can't fix us overnight, Jessica. What you did, it tore this family apart. The kids had to grow up faster than they should have. I've spent every day trying to hold everything together, and I'm still not sure if I've done enough." Jessica nodded, her tears silent now. "I understand. I don't expect forgiveness right away. I just want a chance to be their mom again, to be part of this family." Eric leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "You'll have to earn that, Jessica. Not with words, but with actions." The days that followed were a test for everyone. Jessica worked tirelessly to regain her children's trust. She attended every parent-teacher meeting, helped Lila with her art projects, and spent hours building Lego sets with Ben. Slowly the walls began to crack. Lila started asking Jessica to review her sketches, seeking her opinion in a way she hadn't before. Ben would eagerly recount his day at school, his face lighting up when Jessica laughed at his stories. But just as things seemed to improve, a shadow loomed over them. Ryan Carter, though still incarcerated, had managed to orchestrate a final act of vengeance. Eric received an anonymous call one evening, the distorted voice on the other end chilling him to the bone. "You think this is over? You'll never be safe. None of you." Eric immediately contacted Mark, who assured him that they would look into it. But the threat reignited the fear that had just begun to subside. Eric increased the security around their home, teaching Lila and Ben how to recognize danger and ensuring Jessica wasn't left alone. The climax came on a stormy night, when Eric's fears became reality. A power outage plunged the house into darkness, and Eric's phone buzzed with a single text, "Time's up." Eric's heart raced as he ushered Jessica and the kids into the basement, locking the door behind them. "Stay here," he instructed, his voice firm. "Don't open the door unless it's me." Armed with a flashlight and the same baseball bat he had used against Marcus Kane, Eric moved through the house, his senses heightened. The sound of breaking glass shattered the silence, followed by the thud of heavy footsteps. Eric's grip tightened on the bat as he approached the living room. A figure stood in the shadows, the beam of Eric's flashlight catching the glint of a knife. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" the intruder growled, his voice familiar. It was one of Ryan's associates, a man Eric had seen in photos during his investigation. Eric didn't respond. Instead, he lunged, swinging the bat with all his strength. The fight was brutal, the two men grappling in the darkened room. Eric's mind raced, his focus solely on protecting his family. With one final swing, he knocked the knife from the intruder's hand, pinning him to the ground. Sirens wailed in the distance as Mark and his team arrived just in time. The intruder was arrested, and Mark assured Eric that this would be the end. "Ryan's network is done," Mark said. "You and your family are finally safe." As the truth emerged, there was no turning back. In the aftermath, Eric and Jessica sat on the porch, watching the sunrise. The storm had passed, both outside and within their lives. Jessica reached for Eric's hand hesitantly, and this time he didn't pull away. "We made it," Jessica said softly. Eric nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Yeah, we did." Those scars remained, the Sanders family had weathered the storm. And as the sun rose higher, they began to believe that the worst was finally behind them. In the months that followed, the Sanders family slowly began to piece their lives back together. It wasn't easy, and the scars of the past lingered like shadows in the corners of their home. Yet, amid the brokenness, they found small glimmers of hope, moments where the cracks in their family began to heal. Jessica threw herself into rebuilding her relationship with Lila and Ben. Every morning, she made them breakfast, packing their lunches with handwritten notes tucked inside. At first, Lila ignored the notes, leaving them crumpled in the bottom of her backpack. But one day she quietly placed one on the fridge, where it stayed alongside Ben's colorful drawings. Eric watched these moments from a cautious distance. He admired Jessica's efforts but couldn't ignore the pang of doubt that still sat heavy in his chest. Could trust ever be fully restored? Could their family truly move forward after everything they had endured? These questions haunted him as much as they inspired him to try. The family began attending counseling together, a neutral space where they could voice their pain, fears, and hopes. Lila, who had carried much of the emotional weight of her mother's absence, spoke through tears one session. "I didn't know if you'd come back, Mom," she said. "And even if you did, I didn't know if I wanted you to." Jessica's heart broke, but she held her daughter's hand tightly. "I know I let you down, Lila. I'll spend the rest of my life proving to you that I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Ben, always the family's peacemaker, chimed in. "We're all together again, right? That's what matters." His simple words carried a wisdom that brought a rare smile to Eric's face. "Yeah, buddy," Eric said. "That's what matters." While the family worked on rebuilding their emotional connections, Eric focused on making their home feel safe again. He installed motion detectors, reinforced the locks, and replaced the broken window from that fateful night. The physical repairs mirrored the emotional ones, a slow but steady process of restoring what had been damaged. Jessica found solace in volunteer work, helping other women who had made similar mistakes rebuild their lives. She shared her story honestly, hoping it could serve as a warning or a source of strength for someone else. These moments of giving back helped her find purpose again, reminding her that redemption wasn't a destination but a journey. Eric, too, underwent his own transformation. The ordeal had taught him hard truths about resilience, forgiveness, and the fragility of trust. He started seeing a therapist on his own, confronting the anger and betrayal he had buried deep. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to grieve, not just for what had been lost but for what could have been. One evening, months after Jessica's return, the family sat together on the porch, watching the sunset. It had become a quiet tradition, an opportunity to reflect on how far they had come. Lila was sketching in her notebook, her pencil moving confidently across the page. Ben was sprawled on the steps, telling a story about a new friend he'd made at school. Jessica and Eric sat side by side, their hands resting lightly on the bench between them. As the sky turned shades of orange and pink, Eric broke the silence. "You know, for a long time, I wasn't sure we'd ever get here." Jessica turned to him, her eyes filled with both gratitude and sadness. "Neither was I. But we did." Eric nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "We're not perfect and we never will be. But maybe that's okay. Maybe that's enough." The kids' laughter filled the air as Ben tried to steal Lila's sketchbook, prompting her to chase him across the yard. Jessica smiled, her heart full as she watched her children play. "I'll take imperfect," she said softly. "As long as we're together." That night, as the house settled into quiet, Jessica found herself standing in the hallway outside Lila's room. She hesitated for a moment before knocking lightly. "Can I come in?" Lila looked up from her sketchbook, her expression guarded but not closed off. "Yeah." Jessica stepped inside, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I just wanted to say thank you," she began, "for giving me a chance to be here with you again. I know it hasn't been easy." Lila put down her pencil, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm trying, Mom. I really am." Jessica reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind Lila's ear. "That's all I could ever ask." As silence fell, the echoes of their choices lingered in the air, a quiet reminder of the journey they had taken to get here. In the years that followed, the Sanders family found their way forward, one step at a time. Jessica and Eric's relationship wasn't the same as it had been before the betrayal. It was different, scarred but stronger in its own way. They had learned to communicate more openly, to lean on each other when things got hard. Lila blossomed into a confident, compassionate young woman. Her art, once an escape, became a passion she pursued with purpose. Ben, ever the optimist, grew into a boy who radiated kindness, his laughter filling every room he entered. As for Eric, he found peace in small moments. A quiet evening with his family, a successful case at work, the knowledge that they had faced the worst and come out the other side. Life wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and that was enough. Their story was a testament to the resilience of love, the power of forgiveness, and the strength it takes to rebuild after everything falls apart. It wasn't the ending they had envisioned, but it was one they had earned, and that made all the difference. The past has a way of creeping back even when buried deep. As Jessica unpacked a box of old family photos one afternoon, she stumbled upon a forgotten album tucked beneath years of dust and regret. It was a photo album Eric had put together when Lila was just a baby. She flipped through the pages slowly, each snapshot a reminder of the life they had shared before everything went wrong. A pang of guilt pierced her heart as she lingered on a picture of Eric cradling Lila in his arms, his face radiating pride and love. Lost in the bittersweet nostalgia, Jessica didn't notice Eric enter the room until he spoke. "I remember that day," he said, his voice quiet but tinged with a heaviness she couldn't ignore. Jessica jumped slightly, quickly closing the album. "I didn't mean to." Eric held up a hand. "It's fine. You don't have to explain." He sat down beside her, his gaze fixed on the album she clutched tightly. After a moment of silence, he sighed. "There's something I haven't told you." Jessica looked at him, her heart skipping a beat. "What is it?" Eric hesitated, his jaw tightening. "It's about a case I worked on a few years ago. A case I never told you about because I thought I was protecting us." Jessica's brow furrowed. "Protecting us from what?" Eric exhaled deeply, as if releasing a burden he'd carried for far too long. "It was right after Ben was born. I was hired to investigate a series of fraudulent deals tied to a local businessman. That businessman was Ryan." Jessica's eyes widened. "You knew him before all of this?" Eric nodded. "I didn't know it was him at first. The name on the documents wasn't his, it was one of his shell companies. But as I dug deeper, I started connecting the dots. I realized he was laundering money, running illegal gambling operations, and extorting local businesses. Jessica's stomach turned. Why didn't you tell me? I thought I could handle it on my own, Eric admitted. I reported everything to the authorities and gave them enough evidence to launch an investigation. But Ryan was smart. He had people on the inside. The case fell apart before it could go to court. Jessica's mind raced, piecing together the implications. Is that why he came after me? Did he know you were the one who started the investigation? Eric's expression darkened. I don't think he knew at first. But when I started digging into your affair and realized who he was, I knew it was only a matter of time before he connected the dots. Jessica's hands trembled as she processed the revelation. So all of this, it started because of you? Eric shook his head. No, Jessica. It started because of him. Ryan's been a predator for years. I just tried to stop him before he hurt more people. But I failed. Jessica's voice wavered. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Maybe if I had known? Would it have changed anything? Eric's tone wasn't accusatory, but the weight of his words hung heavily between them. Would you have walked away from him knowing what you know now? Jessica didn't answer. She couldn't. The truth was too painful to admit even to herself. The revelation added a new layer of complexity to their already strained relationship. Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that she had been a pawn in a game she hadn't even known she was playing. Eric, on the other hand, wrestled with the guilt of his own choices. If he had handled the case differently all those years ago, would their family have been spared this nightmare? As the days went on, the flashbacks of that time began to seep into Eric's dreams. He remembered the late nights spent poring over documents, the phone calls filled with veiled threats, and the constant fear that someone would retaliate against him. He had buried those memories deep, convincing himself that he had done the right thing. But now, with Ryan's shadow still looming over their family, Eric wasn't so sure. Jessica, too, found herself haunted by memories she had tried to forget. She thought back to the first time she met Ryan, how his charm had made her feel special in a way she hadn't felt in years. She realized now that he had been playing her from the start, using her vulnerability to his advantage. The realization was a bitter pill to swallow, but it also gave her a new sense of clarity. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Jessica broke the silence. Do you regret it? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eric looked at her, his brow furrowing. Regret what? Taking on Ryan's case. Digging into his life. Everything that came after. Eric considered her question carefully. I regret that it hurt us, he said finally. But I don't regret trying to stop him. People like Ryan thrive on fear and silence. Someone had to stand up to him. Jessica nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. I wish I had seen him for who he really was. Maybe if I had been stronger. Don't do that, Eric interrupted, his voice firm but gentle. Don't blame yourself for falling for his lies. Ryan was a master manipulator. He knew exactly how to exploit people's weaknesses. Jessica's eyes filled with tears. But I hurt you, Eric. I hurt our family. Eric reached for her hand, his touch hesitant but sincere. You did. But you're here now trying to make it right. That's what matters. The conversation marked a turning point for both of them. The hidden truths and buried memories had been brought to light, forcing them to confront their pain head-on. It wasn't an easy process, but it was necessary. For the first time in a long time, they began to see each other not as enemies, but as partners in the fight to rebuild their lives. The past has a way of creeping back even when buried deep. But for the Sanders family, facing that past was the first step toward a better future. Help can come from the most unlikely places, or so it seemed. The knock at the door one rainy afternoon startled Jessica and Eric, who had been sitting in silence in the living room, their thoughts clouded by the weight of everything they'd endured. Eric approached the door cautiously, his hand instinctively resting on the baseball bat he kept nearby. When he opened it, he was met with a face he hadn't seen in years, Detective Rachel Keller, a former colleague from his private investigation days. Rachel? Eric asked, his voice tinged with surprise and suspicion. Rachel, drenched from the rain, offered a faint smile. Eric, can I come in? We need to talk. Jessica, watching from the hallway, stiffened at the sight of the woman. She didn't know Rachel, but something about her presence felt both reassuring and unsettling. Eric hesitated for a moment before stepping aside, allowing Rachel into their home. I heard about what's been going on, Rachel began, pulling a manila folder from her bag as she sat down. Ryan Carter's name has been all over the news and your name's been mentioned too. I figured you might need some help. Eric crossed his arms, his skepticism evident. What kind of help? Rachel opened the folder, revealing a stack of documents, photos, and handwritten notes. I've been tracking Ryan's operations for years, long before you started investigating him. He's not just a con artist or a manipulator. He's tied to an international money laundering ring, and I've been trying to bring him down. Jessica, now standing in the doorway, spoke for the first time. If you've been tracking him for so long, why haven't you stopped him? Rachel's expression darkened. Because Ryan has connections. Powerful ones. Every time I get close, someone tips him off or the evidence disappears. But now, with Marcus Kane behind bars and Ryan's associates scrambling, this might be our only chance to finish what we started. Eric studied Rachel carefully, his mind racing. Her timing was convenient. Too convenient. Why now? Why come to us after all this time? Rachel leaned forward, her voice low but urgent. Because you're in deeper than you realize. Ryan isn't just after revenge. He's trying to tie up loose ends. You, Jessica, your family, your loose ends. If we don't act fast, he'll find a way to hurt you, even from prison. Jessica's face paled as the weight of Rachel's words sank in. What do you need from us? She asked hesitantly. Rachel's eyes softened as she looked at Jessica. I need your cooperation. Jessica, you know things about Ryan's operations, things that could help us take down his entire network. And Eric, your skills as an investigator could be invaluable. But I need to know I can trust you. Eric exchanged a wary glance with Jessica. And how do we know we can trust you? Rachel leaned back, her expression unreadable. You don't. But I think we both know you don't have many other options. Over the next few days, Rachel worked closely with Eric and Jessica, piecing together the fragmented details of Ryan's empire. Jessica provided information about the money transfers she had been involved in, while Eric shared the evidence he had collected during his initial investigation. Together they began to see the full scope of Ryan's operations, and the danger they were in. But not everything added up. Rachel was evasive when Eric pressed her about her superiors, dodging questions about who she was working for and how she planned to use the information. Eric's instincts, honed from years of uncovering lies, told him there was more to Rachel's story than she was letting on. One night, after Jessica and the kids had gone to bed, Eric confronted Rachel. You're not telling me everything, he said bluntly. Who are you really working for? Rachel hesitated, her usual composure faltering. It's complicated, Eric. Uncomplicated, Eric demanded, his voice firm. If we're going to risk everything by trusting you, I need the truth. Rachel sighed, running a hand through her hair. I used to work for the FBI, she admitted. But I was forced out after a case went sideways. Ryan's network had people on the inside and they framed me to protect him. Since then, I've been working independently trying to bring him down. This isn't just about justice for you, it's personal for me. Eric's jaw tightened as he processed her words. And what happens if we succeed? Do you get your career back? Do you walk away with the credit while we're left to clean up the mess? Rachel met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mix of determination and regret. I'm not here for glory, Eric. I'm here because I've seen what Ryan's done to people, good people. I don't want your family to end up on that list. Eric wanted to believe her, but the lingering doubt gnawed at him. Rachel's motivations were too murky, her past too tangled with Ryan's crimes. Yet, as much as he distrusted her, he couldn't deny that she was their best chance at stopping him for good. As the trio worked together, tensions simmered beneath the surface. Rachel's true intentions remained unclear, and Jessica struggled with her own guilt and fear. But the stakes were too high to let their doubts derail their efforts. Then one night, everything came to a head. While reviewing documents in Eric's office, Rachel received a call that sent her into a panic. They know, she said, her voice trembling as she ended the call. Ryan's people know what we're doing? Eric's blood ran cold. How? I don't know, Rachel admitted. But we need to move fast. If they're onto us, they'll come after you first. Jessica, overhearing the conversation, joined them in the office. What do we do? Rachel hesitated before handing Eric a flash drive. This has everything we've gathered so far. Take it to Detective Hayes, he's one of the few people I trust. But you need to leave tonight. They'll come for this. Eric took the drive, his mind racing. And what about you? Rachel's expression hardened. I'll hold them off. You need to protect your family. Jessica's voice cracked as she spoke. Why are you doing this? Why are you risking everything for us? Rachel hesitated, her guarded exterior slipping for just a moment. Because I've lost people to Ryan before. I couldn't save them. But maybe I can save you. As Eric and Jessica packed their essentials and prepared to leave, Rachel stayed behind, armed and ready for the inevitable confrontation. When Ryan's associates arrived later that night, she held her ground, buying the Sanders family enough time to escape. The next morning, Eric delivered the flash drive to Detective Hayes, who assured him that it would be enough to dismantle Ryan's network once and for all. But Rachel's fate remained unknown. Days turned into weeks with no word from her, leaving Eric and Jessica to wonder if she had paid the ultimate price for their safety. Help can come from the most unlikely places, or so it seemed. Rachel's sacrifice was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there are people willing to fight for what's right, no matter the cost. Some choices leave scars no matter which path you take. Eric sat alone in his office late at night, the room dimly lit by the soft glow of his desk lamp. The flash drive Rachel had handed him lay on the desk, a small but weighty object that seemed to hold the future of his family in its cold, metallic shell. His hand hovered over it, his fingers twitching with hesitation. He knew what needed to be done: deliver it to Detective Hayes and finally dismantle Ryan's criminal network. But the path forward felt treacherous, riddled with uncertainty and the echoes of his own doubts. Every decision Eric had made over the past year felt like a gamble. Had he pushed too far by investigating Ryan? Could he have handled Jessica's betrayal differently? And now, as the flash drive sat before him, he wondered if exposing Ryan would finally free his family or plunge them into deeper danger. Eric's mind churned with conflicting thoughts, each one louder than the last. Jessica appeared in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the dim hallway light. "You haven't come to bed," she said softly, her voice carrying the exhaustion they both felt. Eric gestured to the flash drive without looking at her. "I've been thinking." Jessica stepped inside, pulling her robe tighter around her as she crossed her arms. "About what?" Eric sighed, rubbing his temples. "About whether I'm doing the right thing. If I hand this over, Ryan's network might crumble. But what's stopping his people from retaliating? What's stopping them from coming after us?" Jessica moved closer, her face pale but determined. "Eric, we've come too far to stop now. You can't let him win." Eric slammed his fist on the desk, the sharp sound reverberating through the small office. "What if pushing this further puts us in more danger? What if I'm wrong? What if—" His voice cracked and he turned away, his hands gripping the back of his chair. "What if I'm not enough to protect all of you?" Jessica placed a tentative hand on his shoulder, her touch grounding him in a way words couldn't. "You've been more than enough," she said gently. "You've held this family together when everything was falling apart. But you don't have to carry this alone anymore." Eric turned to face her, his eyes filled with frustration, guilt, and desperation. "You don't understand. I've spent my whole life believing I could solve every problem, fix every mistake. But this feels bigger than me, bigger than us." Jessica knelt beside him, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "It is bigger than us. But that's why you have to let go of the idea that you can control everything. You're not alone in this, Eric. You have me. You have the kids. And for whatever it's worth, you have Rachel." Her words hung in the air, a stark reminder of the risk Rachel had taken to help them. Eric had spent weeks questioning her motives, doubting whether she truly wanted to help or if she had her own agenda. But her sacrifice, staying behind to hold off Ryan's associates while they escaped, had forced him to reconsider. Trusting her had been a leap of faith, one he wasn't sure he was ready to take again. "I'm afraid," Eric admitted, his voice barely audible. "Not just for us but for what happens if I let this go. What if exposing Ryan's network doesn't fix anything? What if it just makes things worse?" Jessica tightened her grip on his hand. "Then we face it together. Whatever happens, we'll deal with it as a family. But you can't let fear stop you from doing what's right." Her words struck a chord deep within Eric. He had always prided himself on his moral compass, on his ability to distinguish right from wrong. But the past year had blurred those lines, forcing him to make compromises he never thought he would. Now, as he stared at the flash drive, he realized this was his chance to reclaim that part of himself. The part that believed in justice no matter the cost. The next morning, Eric called Detective Hayes, arranging to meet at a secure location to hand over the evidence. As he got ready to leave, Jessica approached him with a mix of pride and worry in her eyes. "You're doing the right thing," she said softly. Eric hesitated, adjusting his jacket. "I hope so. But it doesn't feel like it." Jessica placed her hand on his cheek, forcing him to meet her gaze. "Sometimes doing the right thing feels like the hardest thing. But that doesn't make it any less right." Eric nodded, her words giving him the strength he needed. He kissed her forehead and left the house, the flash drive tucked securely in his pocket. The meeting with Hayes was tense. The detective reviewed the evidence quickly, his expression growing graver with each passing minute. "This is everything we need," Hayes said finally. "Ryan's network won't survive this." But as Eric left the precinct, his mind was far from at ease. He knew this was only the beginning of a new battle, a battle that would test everything he believed in. That evening, Eric returned home to find Jessica and the kids waiting for him in the living room. The tension in the air was palpable, but there was also an unspoken sense of hope, a belief that perhaps they were finally on the path to freedom. Eric sat beside Jessica on the couch, his gaze fixed on the floor. "It's done," he said quietly. "Hayes has everything he needs." Jessica placed a hand on his, her touch steadying him. "And how do you feel?" Eric paused, searching for the right words. "Scared," he admitted. "But for the first time in a long time I feel like we're on the right path." Jessica nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We'll figure it out. One step at a time." The kids joined them on the couch, their laughter breaking through the heavy silence. For a moment, Eric allowed himself to believe that they would be okay. That their scars, though deep, were a testament to their resilience. A reminder of the strength it took to confront their fears, their mistakes, and their doubts. Some choices leave scars no matter which path you take. But for Eric and Jessica, those scars had become a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, they had found the courage to move forward. And as the stars began to twinkle overhead, they held on to the hope that, together, they could face whatever came next.